Out past Lone Mesa, where dry wind carves stories into canyon walls and silence speaks louder than guns, a quiet cowboy named Buck Nolan minds his land, his cattle, and not much else. Folks don't see him in town much, unless it's Sunday service or a supply run. He don't say much either. But when a slick land agent named Silas Breedwell rolls in with a forged deed and claims the only spring in 50 miles, Buck's Spring, suddenly, quiet don't mean weak anymore. Breedwell's got papers, politicians, and the sheriff in his pocket. Buck's got a fence post, a yellowed survey map, and something the others don't: truth. Now the man who never wanted trouble is the only one standing between Lone Mesa and a water war. He's not wearing a badge, he ain't riding with a posse, but when you've got the law on your side and grit in your bones, sometimes that's enough. What'll Buck do when the law turns crooked, the town turns silent, and his cattle start dying? Will the truth ride faster than greed, or will the desert claim one more quiet man? If you've ever had to stand alone just to do what's right, this story's for you. Drop a comment below from Texas to Montana, and don't forget to saddle up and subscribe for more frontier justice. The wind carried dust and heat across the plains of Lone Mesa, like it had something to prove. Out where fences were still hand-mended and silence meant respect, Buck Nolan rode the edge of his pasture line, eyes scanning the horizon. The spring gurgled steady behind him, tucked in a shaded gully lined with cottonwood and mule's ear. His father called it the ranch's lifeblood. Buck called it home. He wasn't the kind to say much. Folks in town figured he liked his cattle better than conversation. Maybe they were right. Buck kept to his routines: sunrise check, midday trough refill, Sunday ride into church if the horses weren't limping. But that morning, something itched under his skin, a feeling like the ground was going to shift and leave his boots behind. When he reached the ridge and looked down at the town square, Buck tugged the brim of his hat lower. A crowd had gathered, too many for a Monday. The bulletin board outside the sheriff's office fluttered with fresh paper, and right in the center of it all stood Silas Breedwell, polished as a silver bit, grinning like he'd already won. Breedwell was a land agent, slicker than a greased hinge and just as noisy. Folks said he came from back east, where lawyers wore cologne and smiled when they stole from you. He'd set up shop in Lone Mesa 6 months ago, talking fast about rail corridors and reclaiming idle lands. Buck hadn't paid him much mind, until now. He rode into town slow, his Appaloosa's hooves clicking against the cracked boards of Main Street. Eyes followed him as he dismounted, dusted off his sleeves, and approached the notice board. Sheriff Darnell stood to the side, arms crossed tight across his chest, jaw ticking like a man who'd bitten something bitter and couldn't spit it out. Buck didn't say a word. He just read the posting. Public notice. Effective immediately, pursuant to claim reference number 47B, filed and certified with Carson County Office, Mr. Silas Breedwell assumes water rights to parcel lands adjoining Nolan Spring for public development and redistribution. Below it, Breedwell's signature curled like a snake. Buck blinked once, then again. He reached up, tracing the document with a calloused finger. It was real ink, real seal, real enough to scare a man who knew every inch of his land. That spring's been on Nolan soil since my granddaddy's boots first touched dirt, Buck said, voice quiet but firm. Breedwell turned, too bright and too fast. Afternoon, Mr. Nolan. Just the man I hoped to see. Buck's jaw flexed. You got no right posting that. Oh, but I do. Newly activated claim. Deed signed by a prospector, one Mr. Glenn Roy. Perhaps you've heard of him. Seems he failed to complete registration until now. But the law's the law. The man's been dead 12 years. Breedwell tisked. The law doesn't expire with a heartbeat. It expires with paperwork. And mine's in order. Buck stared him down. We'll see about that. Sheriff Darnell cleared his throat. Now, Buck, let's not go making a scene. Buck looked at the sheriff's coat. Something glinted just under the flap, a folded envelope, just tucked enough to not be part of uniform. Buck didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. The way Breedwell smiled and patted Darnell's arm said plenty. Buck stepped back, eyes hard. He didn't yell, didn't curse, just turned, mounted his horse, and rode out the way he came. Past the general store, past the stables, and up the trail that led home. Back at the spring, he knelt beside the trickling water, ran a palm through it, and watched the ripples settle. Then he stood. Trouble had come to Lone Mesa, and it was wearing polished boots and ink on paper. But Buck Nolan wasn't about to let the land die quiet. Buck rode hard across the brittle grass flats, sun slipping west like it didn't want to watch what was coming. He didn't stop at the ranch, didn't check the troughs or mend the broken fence by the south post. He just tied his horse loose under the cottonwoods and headed toward the old schoolhouse that hadn't rung its bell since the last teacher left town in spring. Except one. Ada Whitlow still lived in the rooms behind it, kept the keys, the ink bottles, and the county maps no one else cared to save. Her husband had died in the war back when Buck was still a boy. She never remarried, never left. Ada believed in books, in kids, and in the idea that a straight line on a map ought to mean something. She opened the door before he knocked. "I heard," she said simply. Buck nodded once, removed his hat. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside. I kept the stove warm. Inside smelled like lemon oil and old paper. The walls were lined with shelves of school records, ink-stained boxes, and rolled maps tied in string. Buck stood near the center of the room, hat clutched in one hand, heart still pounding from the notice. "I need to see the water maps," he said, back before the spring got named on property lists. Ada motioned to the trunk beside the desk. Bottom drawer, scroll labeled 1971 to 1880. Should be there. Buck knelt. The trunk creaked like an old joint as he lifted the lid. He worked methodically, lifting each scroll and reading the tags. Finally, one caught his eye. Faded writing, torn edge, initials stamped faintly in the corner. FD, Carson Water District. He unrolled it across her desk. Ada leaned over, adjusting her spectacles. "That's it. That's the survey when they first counted off water sources west of Mesa Butte. Here, see that?" She pointed to a faint curve etched near the lower third. "Spring 4B, your land." Buck leaned in. The initials FD were printed neat beside it. "That don't match the name on Breedwell's paper." Ada nodded slowly. "I figured as much. Silas came by here last week asking about land records, claimed he was researching for development. Did he ask to see this?" She shook her head. "I told him all land survey maps were in county archives, which ain't exactly true. Some I keep because county likes to lose what don't matter to them." Buck's jaw tensed. "The deed he posted, it says Glenn Roy signed over the spring rights in 1884, but this map's dated 1882. That spring was already noted under someone else's initials." Ada frowned. "And Roy, wasn't he the man who donated books to this school before he died?" Buck looked up. "You'd still have that registry?" She didn't answer, just turned, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old bound ledger. She flipped past weathered pages until she stopped and tapped a line with her finger. "Donation made by G.R. Roy, signed in his hand, 1883. Buck scanned the signature, a fluid loop on the R, a clean strike through the Y. He remembered Breedwell's posting, different slant, no loop, didn't match. Ada exhaled slowly. If he forged that signature, this whole claim's poison. Buck straightened. "Can I borrow the ledger?" Ada met his eyes. "You can take the copy I made last year. Folks said I was wasting ink. Maybe I wasn't." Buck took the copy gently, tucking it under his coat. "I'll ride to the next county first light. Breedwell's got the sheriff here, but he don't have the truth." As he turned to go, Ada called out, "Be careful, Buck. That man's not just chasing water. He's chasing control." "I know," Buck said quietly, "but I ain't about to let him take what my family bled for." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the cottonwoods like dry whispers. Breedwell had ink. Buck had history. And now, he had proof it didn't add up. The next morning, Buck saddled his gelding before the frost had a chance to melt off the grass. The sky was the color of a rusted nail, and the cold bit through his jacket like it held a grudge. He packed light, a copy of the map from Ada, the school's donation ledger, and a coil of jerky wrapped in wax paper. He wasn't riding for conversation. He was riding for truth. Elias Tompkins lived out near Granger Pass, tucked against a slope that caught the last of the sun and none of the gossip. He'd been a federal surveyor back when men still argued whether Lone Mesa was worth the ink to draw. Folks said his compass was straighter than any judge and his memory sharper than a fence barb. Buck hadn't seen him in over a year, but he knew if anyone could remember how that spring came to be marked, it was Elias. By noon, Buck reined in at a weather-worn cabin with smoke curling out the chimney and a faded U.S. Land Office sign still hanging crooked beside the door. A hound barked once, more out of duty than threat, and a voice called from inside. "Door's open, long as you ain't selling religion or land you don't own." Buck stepped in, removing his hat. "Elias." The old man looked up from a pot of stew, his gray beard tangled, eyes like wet stone. "Well, I'll be. Buck Nolan. I figured you'd be out fixing fence posts, not knocking on doors." "I would be," Buck said, "if a man named Silas Breedwell hadn't posted notice saying he owns my spring." Elias straightened. "He did what?" Buck laid the documents on the table. Ada's map, the donation record, the notice from town. Elias studied them, fingers tracing the aged parchment with care. "That's my mark," he said quietly, pointing to the initials on the map. "FD, Federal District. I was assigned this quadrant in '82. That spring wasn't private land back then. It was marked for potential municipal supply, but no claim was filed. And this deed Breedwell's flashing around," Buck added, "says it was signed in '84 by Glenn Roy." Elias's mouth tightened. "Impossible. That spring didn't even get parceled for sale till '86. Roy couldn't sell what didn't legally exist." Buck leaned forward. "You'll testify to that?" Elias hesitated, then nodded. "I got my original field notes. Ink and dirt don't lie. But Buck," he paused, pouring them both coffee from an old kettle. "That man Breedwell, he's not working alone. Men like him never do." Buck took a slow sip, eyes steady. "I ain't looking for a fight, just the truth." Elias chuckled without mirth. "Son, out here, truth is the fight." They spent an hour poring over old ledgers. Elias retrieved a brittle field book from a tin box, pages full of hand-drawn contour lines and date stamps. There it was, plain as day. Spring 4B, public designation, no private title as of survey date. Dated 2 years before Breedwell's so-called deed. Buck rolled up the documents, careful not to bend the old man's notes. "I'll file in Carson County by week's end," he said. "They've got a judge still worth his boots." Elias nodded. "You can use my affidavit, but keep it quiet till it's filed. Breedwell buys ink, but he also buys silence." Buck looked him in the eye. "Then I'll keep mine loud." As Buck stepped outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling low through the trees. It wasn't just winter settling in, it was change. Back in the saddle, Buck tucked the affidavit beneath his coat. The land was still his, but proving it would take more than barbed wire and memory. Saturday rolled in like a promise. Dust rose from Lone Mesa's fairgrounds, mixing with the scent of roasted corn and saddle oil. The annual rodeo drew in ranchers from 5 counties, each chasing silver belt buckles and the right to brag until next year. But beneath the music and cheers, the air held something else, tension, like a rope pulled too tight. Buck Nolan didn't come to ride or cheer. He came to listen. He kept to the edge of the crowd, hat pulled low, boots silent on the dry grass. He watched Silas Breedwell work the arena like a preacher at revival, laughing too loud, shaking hands with councilmen, buying drinks for folks who never used to get invited to his table. Breedwell stood near the judge's tent now, glass of bourbon in one hand, his other gesturing wide as he spun talk of rail expansion and new opportunities. The men around him nodded politely, but Buck saw the way their eyes shifted. Too fast, too careful. Buck's stomach tightened when he spotted Sheriff Darnell by the fence, tipping his hat to Breedwell like they were old friends. The sheriff didn't drink, but he held a bottle anyway, enough to be seen holding it, not enough to taste. "Politics," a voice drawled behind him. Buck turned to see Ada Whitlow, her shawl pinned tight against the wind. You'd think they'd at least wait till after the bronc riding to sell the county. Buck gave a small nod. He's setting roots fast. Ada's gaze followed his. And poisoning the ground while he's at it. They stood in silence a moment, watching Breedwell slap the back of a county clerk like they were old-school chums. Then Buck spoke. Elias gave me the affidavit. I ride out to file Monday. Ada's lips pressed tight. You'd better move quick. I heard the clerk's office is being reorganized after the rodeo. Buck's eyes narrowed. Convenient timing. Too convenient. Later that night, while the crowd drifted toward the campfire sing-along and the stars took their places in the sky, Buck slipped behind the main tent. His boots crunched on dry dirt as he made his way toward the record-keeper's storage wagon, an old canvas-covered rig parked behind the clerk's quarters. He tested the door. Locked. Buck stepped back, scanning the alley. No one. A moment later, he reached beneath the bench rail and pulled the hidden pin, a trick old Eli had taught him in his youth. The lock clicked free. He slipped inside. The smell hit him first. Charred wood, scorched paper, and something chemical, bitter. The ledger sat open on the small desk, its edges curled, blackened. Pages were missing. Others had corners burned off, like someone lit it just long enough to do damage without drawing too much smoke. Buck flipped through the remains. Parcel 4B, missing. But in the ashes beneath the table, he found a stub, a thin fragment, half burned and forgotten, the words barely legible. Spring 4B, water control filing. File ref. Pending. Buck stared at it for a long moment, then slipped it into his pocket with the same care he'd give a newborn calf. He stepped out into the cool night, closing the wagon quietly behind him. The moon hung high now, casting silver across the mesa. From the arena came the distant whoop of a winning ride, followed by applause. But Buck didn't smile. Breedwell was covering his tracks. And the town? Too busy dancing to see what was slipping away. As Buck mounted his horse and turned toward home, he felt the weight of something heavy but clear settle on his shoulders. Come Monday, he'd have to ride faster than silence, and louder than fear. Buck left Lone Mesa under cover of dawn, the color of the sky still more ash than blue. The affidavit from Elias was tucked in his saddlebag, wrapped in oilskin. Ada's water map and the half-burned stub from the clerk's wagon were folded flat in a tin box under his coat. He rode west, toward the Carson County seat, a longer ride but one untouched by Breedwell's fingerprints. The wind kicked up dry across the plains. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and Buck's horse snorted, sensing his rider's tension. Buck didn't speak a word the entire ride. He didn't have to. His jaw spoke for him, tight as a cinch strap and just as unforgiving. He arrived just after noon. The county registrar's office sat between the post depot and the grain exchange. The wood siding faded, but the shingles new, signs of recent funding, or at least someone who gave a damn. Buck stepped inside, hat in hand. A clerk with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers looked up from behind the desk. Help you? I'm here to file a homestead claim. Agricultural necessity, emergency exemption. The man raised an eyebrow. Got your supporting documents? Buck set down the tin box. Affidavit from a federal surveyor, water rights map from 1882, and a notice of tampering back in Lone Mesa. The clerk studied him for a beat longer than necessary, then motioned to the bench. Give me an hour. Buck sat by the window, staring out as townsfolk passed by, carrying sacks of flour, herding tired children, living lives not yet touched by crooked land agents. When the clerk returned, his face had shifted. Everything's in order. We'll process this by end of day. Buck nodded, quiet relief softening his shoulders. Thank you. He left the office without ceremony and rode home under a wide, yellowing sky. But the land don't stay quiet long. 2 nights later, Buck rose early to feed the cattle. The sun hadn't cleared the ridgeline when he noticed it, the strange smell near the north trough. Sweet and sharp. Wrong. His dog, Scout, lay nearby, panting hard, tongue dark at the edges. Buck knelt beside him, heart sinking. "Scout," he whispered. The dog tried to lift his head, then slumped. Buck scanned the ground. No snake bites, no injuries, just the water trough, its surface rippling faintly, oily. His hands clenched. He dipped a ladle and sniffed. The sharpness hit his nose hard, bitter like lamp oil, undercut by something metallic. He dumped the trough immediately, digging a trench to divert the poisoned runoff. Then he carried Scout to the shade of the barn, wrapped him in a wool blanket, and cleaned his paws with vinegar. By midday, the vet from Sycamore Hollow arrived. She took one look at Scout and the trough, and her face darkened. "Someone laced this, probably strychnine." Buck nodded grimly. She hesitated. "You got enemies, Mr. Nolan?" He didn't answer, just walked to the barn door and stared out toward town. Later that evening, Buck cleaned out the rest of the feed bins, just to be safe. When he reached the back shelf, something caught his eye, a silver matchbook, wedged between a burlap sack and the barn wall. He picked it up. Stamped in cursive was, "Breedwell's Saloon, fine whiskey, fast deals." Buck turned it over in his hand, then slipped it into his pocket. The matchbook had no business being there, just like Breedwell had no business near his spring. Buck stood in the center of his barn, breathing slow, steady. He hadn't fired a shot, hadn't raised a fist. But now, someone had hurt Scout, and that changed things. Sunday morning in Lone Mesa always started slow, bells chiming from the little white chapel, the smell of cinnamon bread from Ruth Dillard's oven drifting down Main Street. Folks wore their best shirts, kids ran barefoot through the grass outside, and old men leaned on walking sticks like the world was still good. Buck Nolan stood near the back pew, hat in hand. He wasn't much for hymnals, but he respected the quiet. His shoulders were sore from hauling feed, and Scout still hadn't eaten more than a bite. But church meant more than faith. It meant showing face, showing he hadn't backed down. Reverend Booker had just opened the good book when the chapel doors banged wide. Every head turned. Sheriff Darnell stepped in, followed by 2 deputies. His boots echoed sharp on the wood floor. "Buck Nolan," he called, loud enough to hush every breath in the room. Buck turned, eyes steady. "You're under arrest for unauthorized use of restricted water." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Whitlow stood up halfway, her face pale with fury. Buck didn't move, didn't argue. He simply handed his hat to the boy beside him, nodded once to the Reverend, and walked forward with the quiet grace of a man who'd seen this moment coming. Darnell cuffed him at the altar. No resistance. But the shame clung like sweat. They marched him through town, past the mercantile, the saloon, and the grain office. Children stared. A drunk on the corner spat near Buck's boots. Darnell made a show of it, stopping long enough at every intersection to remind folks of the charges. Inside the jail, Buck was pushed into the cell farthest from the window. Iron bars, thin mattress, no words. He sat, arms resting on his knees. The sheriff lingered. "Thought you'd ride off after the poisoning. You're tougher than I gave you credit for." Buck looked up. "You ever think about what's going to happen when Breedwell's done buying loyalty?" Darnell smirked. "You think this town cares who owns a spring? They care about jobs. Progress. Progress don't have to come with lies." The sheriff didn't answer, just walked out, keys jangling behind him. Hours passed. Buck's thoughts drifted between Scout's slow breathing and the burned ledger pages, between Breedwell's grin and Ada's quiet strength. As night fell, the door creaked open again. A different figure stepped inside. Deputy Miller, young, thin, with a mustache he hadn't grown into yet. He looked nervous, eyes darting to the corners of the room like he wasn't sure if he was being watched. He stopped by Buck's cell, glanced over his shoulder, then whispered, "I know this ain't right." Buck said nothing. Miller took a deep breath. "I saw the real deed. It came through last week. Signed and filed under your name. Homestead emergency exemption. I made a copy before the sheriff filed it away." Buck stood slowly. "Where is it now?" Miller swallowed. "In a feed bag, marked for your ranch. I delivered it myself yesterday, pretended it was for your stock." You risk that? I ain't risked near as much as you did, Miller said. His voice cracked, just slightly. I grew up on land my father nearly lost to men like Breedwell. He'd be ashamed if I stood by now. Buck stepped closer to the bars. Thank you. Miller nodded. I'll do more than thank you if this goes public. I'll testify. Buck's voice stayed low. Then be ready. They won't just play legal come next move. The deputy left, silent as a man slipping past his own shadow. In the stillness of the cell, Buck sat back down. The door may have locked behind him, but outside, truth had already slipped through. The courthouse on Ridge Hill wasn't grand, but it had held the weight of justice longer than anyone in Carson County could remember. Wooden benches creaked with the same groans of old trials and land disputes long buried in memory. But today, the room held its breath. Buck Nolan stood at the front in his cleanest shirt, cuffs stiff, collar buttoned high. He hadn't shaved, didn't see the need. The judge knew what kind of man he was. A blade didn't change that. Across the aisle, Silas Breedwell sat smug in a polished vest, papers stacked neat before him. His lawyer, a broad man with a too-slick part in his hair, leaned over every so often, whispering like he was feeding secrets to a snake. The crowd was larger than usual. Ranchers lined the back wall. Ada Whitlow sat on the left, her hands folded over a leather folio. And beside the bench, Deputy Miller stood tall, hat tucked under his arm like it meant something today. Judge Percival Harlan, a narrow man with deep-set eyes and a voice like river gravel, tapped his gavel once. We're here to settle the dispute of water rights regarding Spring 4B and the surrounding acreage. Breedwell's lawyer stood first, walking slowly to the center of the room. Your Honor, our claim is supported by a deed signed in 1884 by one Glenn Roy, with full certification under Carson County law. He placed the document on the clerk's table with theatrical flair. Unless the opposing party has evidence to the contrary, the water rights revert to my client, Mr. Breedwell. The judge looked to Buck. Mr. Nolan. Buck stepped forward and cleared his throat. I have 3 pieces of evidence, Your Honor. He nodded toward Elias Tompkins, who rose from the second row, steady on his cane. The judge motioned him forward. Elias spoke plainly. I surveyed that spring myself in 1882 under federal authority. At that time, the land was unclaimed public use. No deed could legally attach. He placed a yellowed document on the table. The signature on Mr. Breedwell's deed predates legal privatization. Buck turned next to Ada, who handed him a folded page. This is a school donation registry signed by Mr. Glenn Roy in 1883, Buck said. His signature here, looped R, slanted Y, don't match the one on Breedwell's deed. He handed it to the judge. And, finally, Buck added, reaching into his satchel, a county filing stub, found half burned behind the clerk's tent at the Lone Mesa Rodeo. It references a pending water claim. Mine. Judge Harlan raised a brow. Half burned? Yes, sir. Deliberately, looks like. The room stirred. Murmurs spread like prairie fire. Breedwell's lawyer rose, puffed up. This is all circumstantial. Mr. Nolan is attempting to slander my client with dusty maps and guesswork. Buck didn't flinch. He turned toward Miller. Deputy? Miller stepped forward, clearing his throat. Last week, I personally handled the feed delivery to Mr. Nolan's ranch. Inside was a duplicate filing, proper seal, dated and signed. I saw the original before the sheriff hid it. Judge Harlan held up a hand. I'd like to inspect the deed. The clerk brought it to him. He examined the signature, then looked to the school ledger. His lips pressed thin. The handwriting does not match, he said, voice quiet but firm. Furthermore, if the spring remained federal land until 86, any deed filed in 84 would be invalid. He turned to Breedwell, whose grin had vanished. This court finds the claim to be forged. All rights revert to Mr. Nolan under emergency homestead exemption. And Mr. Breedwell, this hearing is over. The gavel struck once. The room exhaled. Breedwell rose, red-faced. You'll regret this. Judge Harlan didn't look up. Forgery voids all claims. If you speak again, I'll hold you in contempt. Buck looked across the room, at Ada, Elias, Miller. He didn't smile, but he didn't need to. Justice had its say. Silas Breedwell didn't show up in town the next day, or the one after that. His storefront office, once full of land maps, polished chairs, and silver-tipped pens, stood locked, the curtains drawn. Rumors swirled like dust in a windstorm. Some said he rode east that same night, others swore he was holed up with a lawyer in Carson. But by midweek, the sheriff had resigned. No farewell, no handshake. Just a notice pinned to the jailhouse door and a key left on the desk. Lone Mesa hadn't seen a reckoning like it in decades. Buck didn't gloat. He didn't even go into town that week. Instead, he stayed on the ranch, fixing the north fence line and tending to Scout, who was eating again, tail thumping at the sound of his boots. Buck moved quiet, his motions steady, like a man who knew storms passed, but fences still broke if you didn't mind 'em. On Thursday, Ada came riding up the trail in a borrowed buggy, her bonnet flapping in the spring wind. "You got a minute?" she called, hitching her horse near the barn. Buck wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Always." She stepped down, holding a rolled-up notice in her hand. "Town vote was yesterday. They asked me to step in as interim land registrar until the county sends someone permanent." Buck raised a brow. "You accept?" "I told them if they wanted truth, they better be ready for it." He smiled, just a little. "They chose right." Ada's face softened. "It wasn't just me they stood behind. Folks said what you did in court, how you handled yourself. It gave 'em backbone." Buck looked down at the ground, then out toward the hills. "I didn't do it to lead." "Doesn't matter. You did." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging at Ada's skirt and Buck's shirt sleeves. Later that day, Elias Tompkins arrived with 2 hands and a wagon load of lumber. "We heard the spring's still too exposed," he said, voice gravelly but warm. "Figured we'd help you fortify it proper." Buck blinked. "You didn't have to." Elias gave a one-shouldered shrug. "Maybe not. But men like Breedwell count on silence. You didn't give it to him. That counts for something." By sundown, there were 10 men out by the spring, digging, hammering, stringing wire. Someone brought stew, someone else strummed a guitar, and when Buck looked around at the mix of old-timers, ranch hands, and town folks, he saw something he hadn't felt in a while. Loyalty. Not the loud kind, not bought or begged, just quiet, steady loyalty. They finished the reinforcement fence by moonrise. A cedar post at the front now bore a carved plank. Nolan Spring, property secured under Homestead Law, 1887. Deputy Miller arrived just as the last nail went in. "You heard?" he asked Buck. "Breedwell's been stripped of his license. Forgery charges pending." Buck nodded. "That enough to keep him gone?" "For now. County sent 2 marshals to track his holdings. Turns out this wasn't the only land he tried to snatch." "What happens next?" Miller took a slow breath. "That depends on what kind of town we want to be." Buck studied him, then glanced toward the spring. "I reckon we start by telling the truth. Every time." Miller smiled faintly. "You think you'll run for office?" Buck chuckled. "No, sir. I'll stick to fence posts and feed sacks." "Well, Lone Mesa's better off with you in it." As the group dispersed, Elias extended a hand. "You carried the law, Buck. Not with a badge, but just as true." Buck shook it, firm. That night, as the fire dimmed, and the stars dusted the mesa sky, Buck sat on his porch with Scout curled at his feet. The spring flowed free again, steady, clean, and his. And for the first time in a long while, Lone Mesa didn't feel like a place just passed through. It felt like home. The morning sun stretched across Lone Mesa like a warm quilt laid gently over the hills. For the first time in weeks, Buck Nolan didn't wake to worry. He didn't check the water line first, didn't scan the horizon for dust trails or carry his rifle into the barn. He just stood on the porch with a coffee mug in hand, Scout curled beside him, both of them soaking in the kind of quiet that didn't mean danger. It meant peace. The spring gurgled in the distance, clear and sure-footed, fenced now with hand-hewn rails and cedar posts. Buck had reinforced the north trough the day before with fresh piping, and the cattle had drunk from it like they knew it was safe again. A wagon rumbled down the main road mid-morning, stirring up a soft cloud of dust. Buck recognized the driver right away, Caleb, the woodworker's son, 17, nervous, and always missing a button. He pulled the wagon to a stop out front, grinning like he'd just met the governor. "Mr. Nolan, sir. Got something from the schoolhouse kids." Buck raised a brow. "That right?" Caleb jumped down, pulled a heavy crate from the back, and opened the lid with care. Inside lay a carved wooden sign, smoothed at the edges, the letters dark and proud. Nolan Spring. Justice runs deep. Buck stared at it for a long moment. His throat tightened, but he managed to quiet. "They carved that themselves?" "Every one of them," Caleb said. "Miss Ada said it was their way of saying thanks, for protecting what's good." Buck nodded once, eyes never leaving the words. He carried the sign out with care and set it along the new fence. Scout followed, tail wagging, still a little slower than usual, but walking again. As Buck hammered in the last nail, he looked out over the hills, golden in the sun, green where spring runoff traced soft fingers into the basin. It looked the same as it had before Breedwell ever showed up, but something had changed. Not the land, the people. That evening, folks trickled in. Some brought food, others tools, and a few just their company. Ada brought molasses pie. Elias came with a fresh-cut post to replace one that had split in the wind. Even young Deputy Miller arrived after his shift, still wearing his badge but with his sleeves rolled high like a ranch hand ready to work. They shared supper by the spring. No speeches, just the sounds of boots on grass, horses chewing, and laughter that didn't ask for permission. Toward sundown, Buck stood near the fence, hat in hand. "I didn't set out to lead no charge," he said, voice even. "Didn't figure my name would end up carved into anything but a headstone." A few chuckled at that. But truth matters, and when a man comes to take something he didn't earn, when he twists law to feed his own hunger, someone's got to stand. He looked down at Scout, then up at the sign. "I reckon I just did what needed doing." Ada stepped beside him, laying a hand gently on his arm. "You did more than that. You reminded this town who we are." The group lingered until the stars blinked overhead and the fire crackled low. One by one, they said their goodbyes, tipping hats, shaking hands. When the last wagon creaked back toward town, Buck stayed at the edge of the spring a while longer. The breeze rolled in soft from the south, rustling the cottonwoods. He tipped his hat toward it, not in farewell, but in respect, to the land, to the folks who stood beside him, to the truth that finally had a place to settle. And as the spring flowed steady and free, Buck Nolan knew Lone Mesa wasn't just a place on a map anymore. It was a place that remembered. Drop a comment if you've ever had to stand alone for what's right. Whether you're from Texas or Montana, we want to hear your story. And if justice and grit speak to your heart, saddle up and subscribe for more tales from the American frontier.